Somewhere in a filing cabinet in Ankara, there is a stack of trial reports that almost nobody has opened since 1949. Not because they were wrong, because they worked. In the early 1940s, the Ottoman Agricultural Institute ran one of the largest livestock forage experiments in Anatolian history. Dozens of crops, hundreds of test plots, thousands of farmers across the Konya Plain, the Black Sea coast, the eastern highlands above Erzurum, all growing the same thing, all feeding their herds without buying a single bag of commercial feed. The yields were real, the protein numbers were real, the nitrogen, the drought tolerance, the frost resistance, all of it, documented, filed, and handed out in seed packets to anyone who asked. Then the war ended, and within a decade, quietly, without announcement, those crops stopped appearing in extension bulletins, stopped showing up in seed catalogs from the bazaars in Konya and Sivas, stopped being taught in the agricultural colleges of Ankara and Izmir. The commercial feed industry stepped in with bags and trucks and a simple message: just buy it. And most farmers did. I have been farming this land in Anatolia for 11 years. When I started, I did what everybody told me to do. I called the cooperative. I ordered the feed. I paid the bill, every month, like clockwork. Some years that bill ran higher than my equipment costs. I told myself, that is just farming now. That is just how it works. Then, 2 winters ago, I found something in a box of my Buyuk Baba's papers. It was an extension bulletin, printed 1944, stapled at the corner, edges brown, typed on a machine that probably weighed 40 pounds. The title read, "Emergency Forage Crops for Livestock Producers, a Field Guide for Wartime Conditions in Anatolia." Inside were 10 crops I had never heard of, protein percentages that matched alfalfa, nitrogen fixation numbers that should have made every fertilizer salesman in Konya nervous, yield data on some of these that an Anatolian field agronomist actually described in his notes as almost too good to be typical for the highland conditions we were farming. I stood in my barn reading that bulletin for an hour. Then I started digging. What I found, across government archives in Ankara, university trial reports from the Faculty of Agriculture at Ege University in Izmir, and agricultural extension records from the 1940s, was a complete system. A full alternative to purchased feed that worked on land nobody thought was productive. Crops that survived the brutal Anatolian winters. Crops that survived the summer drought that cracks the clay on the Konya Plain every July. Crops that fixed their own fertility and fed cattle, sheep, and goats on ground that had not produced a stand in years. And then I found something nobody planned for. Some of these crops were doing a second job the whole time. A job that researchers at Ege University and Ankara University are only now beginning to understand. Stick around for crop number 8, because what the original field agronomist's notes say about its output still raises eyebrows in agricultural circles across Anatolia today. These are the 10 crops they buried. We found them. Let me tell you what the 1940s actually looked like for an Anatolian livestock farmer. Because this is not just history. This is the context that makes everything on this list make sense. By 1942, Anatolia was living through one of the most economically brutal periods in its modern history. The Turkish Republic had declared non-belligerence in the Second World War, but the war consumed everything regardless. Steel, fuel, labor. Young men who had been throwing hay bales across the highlands the previous spring were being mobilized into the Turkish armed forces. The farms they left behind did not stop needing feed. Barley was being redirected. Wheat was being rationed. The commercial grain supply that Anatolian livestock operations had quietly started depending on through the 1930s was suddenly caught inside a global supply chain that had broken apart. Farmers across the Konya Plain, the Aegean Highlands, the Black Sea valleys, all facing the same problem at the same time. Their animals still needed to eat. The Ottoman Agricultural Institute, operating under the Turkish Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, understood what was coming before most farmers did. As early as 1941, the Institute's Bureau of Plant Research had begun accelerating trials on alternative forage crops across every major agricultural region of Anatolia. The goal was not exotic. It was not experimental for the sake of science. It was survival. They needed crops that could grow without purchased inputs, crops that could establish on depleted, low-fertility soil, because wartime farms in the Anatolian interior did not have the money or the labor for extensive soil preparation. Crops that could fix their own nitrogen, because fertilizer was being rationed by the government. Crops that could survive weather events that would kill a conventional stand, the -20-degree winters of eastern Anatolia, the 40-degree summers of the southern plateau, because there was no backup plan and no insurance net that would cover the gap. They found them. Between 1941 and 1946, extension agents from the Turkish Ministry of Agriculture fanned out across the rural Konya Plain, the upper Sakarya Basin, the Euphrates Highlands, and the Aegean coastal zones, carrying seed packets, test protocols, and field observation forms. Trial plots went into ground that had not produced a viable stand in years. Results came back season after season. Protein percentages, dry matter yields, nitrogen fixation rates, palatability observations from livestock that had grazed the stands. The documentation was meticulous. The reports were real. I spent weeks going through archives, agricultural experiment station bulletins from Konya, Eskişehir, Erzurum, Adana, Bursa. Turkish Ministry of Agriculture field reports from county extension offices that most people do not know still exist in digitized government repositories. University trial summaries published in Turkish agricultural journals between 1943 and 1951, and then never reprinted. What I found was not one crop. It was a system, a complete, functioning, field-proven alternative to purchased feed, built from 10 plants that worked differently in different seasons, in different climates, in different soil types across the extraordinary geographic range of Anatolia. Together, they covered the entire year. One crop carried the late autumn, when Anatolian highland grass was done. One carried the winter, when nothing else would germinate above the frost line. One covered the summer heat that shut down every cool season grass on the Konya Plain. And several of them were doing something the farmers who planted them never knew about. I will get to that. But first I need to be precise about something, because it matters for how you use this information. These crops did not disappear because they stopped working. The protein numbers did not change. The drought tolerance did not change. The nitrogen fixation biology did not change. Plants do not forget how to grow because a decade passes. They disappeared because something cheaper to produce, cheaper to market, cheaper to distribute at industrial scale, replaced the knowledge that made them useful. The commercial feed industry that expanded rapidly across Turkey after the Second World War was not built on better science. It was built on better logistics. Trucks, rail, standardized bags, a distribution network stretching from Istanbul to the remotest highland pastures above Erzurum that made it easier to buy than to grow. Extension services, which had spent the war years pushing Anatolian farmers towards self-sufficiency, pivoted. The urgency was gone. The bulletins stopped being printed. The seed sources dried up. Within one agricultural generation, roughly 15 years, the working knowledge of these crops existed only in the memories of older farmers and in filing cabinets in Ankara that nobody was opening anymore. That is what I found in my Büyük Baba's papers, and that is what I went looking for in the archives. Every crop you are about to see has documented protein data. Every one of them has field trial yield records from Anatolian test plots. Several of them have Turkish Ministry of Agriculture-backed nitrogen fixation measurements. This is not folklore. This is not homesteading speculation. This is documented agricultural science from the 1940s sitting in public archives in Ankara, Izmir, and Erzurum, largely untouched. Some of it will surprise you. Some of it will make you angry. And crop number 8, the one the original field agronomist called almost too good to be typical for Anatolian highland conditions, I am going to read you the exact language from the trial report when we get there. Because it is the kind of sentence that changes how you think about what your land is actually capable of producing. 10 crops, 10 documented trials, buried for 70 years. Let us go through every single one. Before we get into the list, if you grow anything on Anatolian soil, raise any livestock, or you are just tired of feed bills that never stop climbing, hit subscribe right now. What we are about to go through took months to find, and we are going to keep digging. You do not want to miss what comes after this video. Crop 1. Hairy Vetch, Vicia villosa. If your highland pasture fails in February above the frost line, this one does not. In the winter of 1943, Turkish Ministry of Agriculture extension agents pushed this crop into the Anatolian interior with exactly that promise. Farmers across the Konya Plain and the upper Sakarya Valley were watching hay prices climb and barley allotments shrink. They needed something that would work on ground that had not been properly managed in years. Hairy Vetch did. It survives down to -12 degrees Celsius, the kind of cold that arrives across the Anatolian plateau without warning in November and stays until March. It spreads fast, buries weeds under a tangling mat of vines, and pulls nitrogen straight from the air, up to 120 kilograms of nitrogen per decar per season. That is 120 kilograms of fertilizer you did not buy on a farm that could not afford to buy it. Protein content runs 20 to 28%. That matches Yonka, the alfalfa Anatolian farmers have paid premium prices for, without the demanding soil requirements. Wartime farmers planted it because they had no choice. Regenerative farmers across the Aegean and the Black Sea highlands are planting it today because they have done the math on purchased inputs and do not like the answer. The math has not changed. Crop 2, crimson clover, Trifolium incarnatum. 8 weeks. Bare ground to grazable forage in 8 weeks. In 1944, that speed kept cattle alive on the Konya Plain when hay ran out. Not because crimson clover was exotic, because it was fast and it asked almost nothing from the soil beneath it. Already a regional staple in the Aegean coastal zones around Izmir and Aydın, the Turkish Ministry of Agriculture pushed it inland across Anatolia during the war because it performed on poor, sandy soils without demanding lime, without demanding fertilizer, without demanding labor that farms had already sent into military service. Protein runs 16 to 20%. It reseeds readily under grazing pressure, meaning a managed stand kept coming back without replanting. On farms that had lost their workers to mobilization, that self-reliance was the difference between staying operational and shutting down. When it blooms, the field turns a blazing deep red. Dense cylindrical flower heads unfurling from the base upward. Honeybees arrive from what seems like kilometers away. The farmer planted it for cattle. He got a functioning pollinator system for free. Crop 3, Austrian winter pea, Pisum sativum arvense. Most crops quit in October on the Anatolian highland. This one is just getting started. Austrian winter pea goes into the ground when most farmers across the plateau are wrapping up the season. It sends out tendrils that grip whatever is nearby, fans out low and dense, and smothers weeds while holding topsoil against the winter wind erosion that strips highland fields every February. Temperatures drop to -10 degrees Celsius. It keeps growing. That cold tolerance was the entire point. The Turkish Ministry of Agriculture paired it with cereal rye and hairy vetch in a combination their internal bulletins called the Kis Yem Uklusu, the winter feed trinity. Each crop covered a different weakness. Together, they kept livestock fed through conditions that would have finished a single crop operation across the Erzurum highlands and the upper Euphrates basin. Protein runs 20 to 25% in the vegetative stage. It fixes nitrogen. It breaks down fast in spring, releasing nutrients directly into the root zone before summer cash crops go in. Agronomists at Ataturk University in Erzurum have been looking at it again. Some things do not need reinventing. They just need remembering. Crop 4. Cowpea, Vigna unguiculata. When summer heat cracked the clay across the southern Anatolian plateau and the cool season crops shut down, this was the plant that held herds together. It had been doing it for centuries before any government program noticed. Cowpea has deep roots in the agricultural traditions of the Eastern Mediterranean and Mesopotamia, the same civilizational belt that produced the first farming settlements along the Tigris and Euphrates. Anatolian smallholders in the Hatay region and along the Syrian border had grown it for generations before extension agents existed. It fed people. It rebuilt soil. By the time the wartime campaign began, the Turkish Ministry of Agriculture was not introducing something new. It was pointing farmers back towards something their dedeleri, their grandfathers, already knew. It sprawls, broad, dark green leaves forming a dense canopy that shades the Anatolian clay, slows evaporation, and outcompetes weeds without spraying anything. On compacted, low-fertility ground baked hard by the southern plateau summer, it pushes through. Drought hits. It keeps going. Crude protein runs 15 to 22%, grazable in 60 days from planting. Livestock eat it readily whether they are grazing the field or working through dried hay. Without it, summer grazing across the southern Anatolian lowlands during the war years looked bleak. With it, herds held condition through heat on fields that cost the farmer almost nothing to manage. Crop 5. Sun hemp, Crotalaria junxia. A foot a week. 6 to 8 feet tall by the end of summer. Dense enough to block competing weeds before they have a chance to establish. And while it is growing, it is fixing 100 to 120 kilograms of nitrogen per dekar into the soil beneath it.
The Turkish Ministry of Agriculture trialed sun hemp extensively across the Mediterranean coastal belt, the Cukurova Plain around Adana, and the Antalya Basin through the 1940s, chasing something they could not find anywhere else. A warm season crop that could build a hay-scale feed reserve over a single Anatolian summer without purchased inputs. Current trial records from the Aegean Agricultural Research Institute in Izmir confirm 2 to 5 tons of dry matter per dekar under favorable southern conditions. At that speed, with that yield, it was difficult to argue against it. Protein runs 20 to 28% before flowering. After flowering, quality drops sharply. That one timing detail separated the farmers across the Cukurova who got full value from the ones who did not. Crop 6. Chicory, Sicorium intybus. Most people across Anatolia know hindiba as something wild that grows along roadsides, or as a bitter green their grandmothers picked from the field edge in spring. What wartime livestock farmers knew was simpler. When the summer drought hit the Anatolian plateau and everything else stopped growing, this one kept going. The reason is underground. Hindiba drives a taproot 1 meter into the soil, down past where summer drought reaches across the Konya Plain, down into mineral layers that shallow-rooted Anatolian grasses never touch. Crude protein runs 15 to 32% depending on growth stage and soil fertility. But here is what no wartime farmer on the Anatolian plateau could have known. Chicory contains natural compounds called sesquiterpene lactones that measurably reduce internal parasite loads in grazing sheep and goats without chemical treatment. Researchers at Ankara University's Faculty of Veterinary Medicine have confirmed this in controlled trials. Farmers in 1944 planted hindiba for feed. They were managing parasites the entire time without knowing it. Crop 7. Forage rape, Brassica napus. Before canola oil appeared in Turkish supermarkets, its close cousin was feeding sheep through November across the northern Anatolian highlands. Forage rape grows fast. Broad, waxy blue-green leaves that lock in nutrients through cold weather. Multiple frosts hit across the Black Sea highlands. It stays standing. It stays palatable. Dry matter protein in the vegetative stage runs 18 to 25%. Sheep work particularly well in rape paddocks where rotational management can stretch a single planting across many weeks of feeding. Highland farms across the Kastamonu, Sinop, and Bolu provinces faced a simple problem before this crop. The feed season ended before the calendar said winter started, a gap of 4 to 6 weeks that cost dearly. Forage rape closed that gap across the northern Anatolian tier, and it still does today in the Highland provinces, where traditional sheep farming has survived the commercial feed era.
Crop 8. Pearl millet, Pennisetum glaucum. I told you at the beginning we found the original trial language. Here it is. A field agronomist writing for the Turkish Ministry of Agriculture in 1946 described pearl millet's per-decker yield as, and I am reading directly from the report, almost too good to be considered typical for Anatolian highland farm conditions at this stage of adoption. That sentence was written 78 years ago on the Konya Plain. The yield data has been confirmed repeatedly since. Pearl millet grows 2 to 3.5 meters tall. Cut it, it comes back. Graze it, it comes back. 3, sometimes 4 cuttings from a single stand in one Anatolian season, while other summer forages gave farmers one shot and quit. Crude protein runs 12 to 18%, and critically, unlike sorghum, which is widely grown across southern Anatolia, pearl millet produces 0 prussic acid, safe to graze immediately, no waiting period, no testing, just feed. When the summer heat shut everything else down across the Anatolian plateau, pearl millet kept going. It still does. Crop 9. Sericea lespedeza, Lespedeza cuneata. Some land was beyond saving, or so farmers thought. By 1942, years of unmanaged tobacco and grain farming had stripped millions of deacres across the central Anatolian plateau to hardpan acid clay, pH values so low that most legumes would not germinate, let alone establish. The usual crops did not apply. Sericea lespedeza did. Wiry, upright, 60 to 100 centimeters tall. On a pH of 4.5, the kind of acid soil found in the degraded highland zones above Korum and Yozgat, it established, fixed nitrogen, and produced summer forage that helped rebuild herds on land the wartime economy had no time to rehabilitate properly. And then, just like Hindiba, researchers found something nobody had planted it for. The condensed tannins in Sericea lespedeza reduce internal parasite loads in grazing sheep and goats.
Barber poleworm and other internal parasites measurably reduced in controlled university trials, without chemical treatment. Research from the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine at Ankara University and collaborative studies through the Aegean Agricultural Research Institute in Izmir have replicated these results. Wartime farmers planted it to save bad land. They were managing parasites without spending a single lira on dewormers. Crop 10. Buckwheat, Phagopyrum esculentum. 70 days, seed to harvest. No other major feed crop on this list does it faster. Caribou day, buckwheat, showed up everywhere across Anatolia during the war. Hog pens in the Marmara region, poultry yards in the Aegean, Turkish Ministry of Agriculture emergency bulletins for land that had nothing else growing on it. It is not glamorous. It is not demanding. It works on the worst fields in the shortest windows with the least input of anything on this list.
Heart-shaped leaves, reddish stems, small white flowers blanketing the field within 6 weeks of planting. And technically, it is not a grain at all. It is related to kuzukulagi and ravent, sorrel and rhubarb, which is exactly why it thrives in poor, low-pH Anatolian soil where real grain crops struggle to establish. The Turkish Ministry of Agriculture pushed it specifically for farms across the highland interior with nothing left to plant. Hog and poultry feed from ground that had not been productive in years. No fertilizer, minimal soil preparation. Plant in July, harvest before the autumn feeding season. For wartime farms across the Anatolian plateau that had lost the window on every other crop, that was everything. Now I am going to tell you something that most channels covering this topic will not. Because here is where I could keep the momentum going,
wrap this up cleanly, and send you off feeling like you have just discovered the answer to every feed bill you have ever paid on Anatolian soil. But that would not be honest. And if I am not honest with you here, nothing else I have said in this video is worth your time. So let me push back on the very story I just told you. These crops are not magic. I need you to hear that clearly before you do anything with this information. Hairy vetch does not replace a complete feeding program by itself on an Anatolian highland farm. Crimson clover will not save a herd that is already in poor condition going into a Konya plain winter. Pearl millet is exceptional, but only if you time the grazing correctly for Anatolian summer conditions, and only if your stocking density does not outrun the regrowth rate. Get that wrong, and you are left with a bare field and hungry animals by mid-August.
The wartime farmers who succeeded with these crops were not succeeding because the crops were miraculous. They were succeeding because they understood their land, they understood their animals, they understood the seasonal gaps across the Anatolian agricultural calendar they were trying to fill, and they matched the right crop to the right gap at the right time. The ones who failed, and some did, grabbed a seed packet without understanding what they were actually planting or why. That failure is just as documented in the extension records held in Ankara as the success. I just did not read you those parts. The disappearance was not entirely a conspiracy. I told you these crops were buried, and in a meaningful sense they were. The knowledge faded. The seed sources dried up in the bazaars. The extension bulletins stopped being printed in Ankara. But I want to be careful not to overstate what happened, because overstatement would make this into a story that is satisfying to watch and useless to act on. The commercial feed industry, expanding across Turkey after the Second World War, was not a coordinated suppression campaign. There was no meeting in a boardroom in Istanbul where someone decided to erase hairy vetch from the Anatolian farming consciousness. What actually happened is more ordinary and in some ways more frustrating. Cheap feed became available at scale. Farmers across Anatolia, exhausted, understaffed, trying to rebuild operations after years of wartime strain and mobilization, took the easier path. They bought the bag. Extension agents who had spent years pushing forage diversity pivoted toward the new economic reality. Universities in Ankara and Izmir followed the funding. The funding followed the industry. It was not a conspiracy, it was drift. And drift is harder to fight than a conspiracy because there is no villain to point at. There is just a long, slow cultural forgetting that happened one Anatolian generation at a time until the knowledge existed only in the memories of older farmers and in filing cabinets in Ankara that nobody was opening. That is what makes it worth digging up. Not because someone hid it, but because nobody thought it was worth keeping. Some of these crops come with real caveats for Anatolian conditions. Sericea lespedeza, crop number 9, should be checked against Turkish Ministry of Agriculture invasive species guidance before planting in your province. The same tannin compounds that reduce parasite loads can also reduce digestibility if animals graze it exclusively for extended periods. It works best as part of a rotation across the Anatolian grazing calendar, not as a monoculture. Sun hemp should not be grazed freely by horses. Pyrrolizidine alkaloids in the plant can cause liver damage in equines over time. Cattle and goats handle it well. If you run a mixed operation in the Aegean or Mediterranean coastal zones, where sun hemp performs best, that distinction matters. Hindiba, chicory, is genuinely exceptional for sheep and goat parasite management across the Anatolian highland zones. But the research on its sesquiterpene lactone content shows significant variation depending on the mineral-rich highland soils above Erzurum versus the shallower, depleted plateau soils of central Anatolia. The benefit is real. The consistency requires management. Forage rape and other brassicas need a grazing introduction period. Livestock moved abruptly onto a heavy brassica stand across the northern Anatolian highlands can develop digestive issues. A 2-week transition, gradually increasing brassica access, is standard practice in the sheep operations of Kastamonu and Bolu that use it for autumn finishing.
The Turkish Ministry of Agriculture trial reports documented these nuances. They are in the records in Ankara. The same bulletins that celebrated the yields also noted the limitations, and responsible use of this information means reading both columns. The modern Anatolian context has changed.
These crops were trialed on 1940s Anatolian farms with 1940s stocking rates, 1940s soil conditions, and 1940s market pressures. Your operation is not a 1940s Anatolian farm. Stocking densities on many modern Anatolian livestock operations are significantly higher than what those wartime test plots in Konya and Erzurum were designed around. If you are running more animals per decker than a wartime extension agent in the Turkish Ministry of Agriculture would have considered reasonable, the math on forage replacement changes. The crops still work, but they work inside a system, and that system has to be designed for your land, your climate, your carrying capacity. The wartime Anatolian farmers who got the most out of these crops were the ones who used them to fill specific gaps in their existing forage calendar. Not to replace everything overnight, not to tear out what was working and start over. They identified one season where feed costs were highest, the February gap above the frost line, the August gap on the baked plateau clay, and they plugged that gap first. That is exactly how I would suggest you approach this. Pick one crop from this list. Pick the season on your Anatolian land where your feed bill hurts the most. Match the two. Try it on one field this year. Because here is the thing about buried knowledge. It does not become useful the moment you uncover it. It becomes useful the moment you put it in the ground. Still here? Good. Because what I am about to show you was not in any extension bulletin printed in Ankara. It was not in any seed catalog from the Konya Bazaar. It was not in the trial summaries I pulled from Ege University in Izmir. It was not in any Turkish Ministry of Agriculture field reports. It was not in anything that was printed, distributed, or handed to farmers across Anatolia during the war years. It was hiding inside the data the whole time, and nobody connected the dots until decades later. Here is what the wartime Anatolian agronomists knew. They knew hairy vetch fixed nitrogen across the Konya plain. They knew crimson clover reseeded under grazing pressure along the Aegean coast. They knew pearl millet came back after every cut across the southern Çukurova. They knew Sericea lespedeza established on the acid clay soils of the degraded central Anatolian plateau that nothing else would touch. They documented all of it, yield by yield, season by season, field by field across Anatolia. What they did not know, what they could not have known with 1940s science, was that several of these crops were running a second biological program completely underneath the one they were being studied for. Not a metaphor. Literally, a second program. The tannin system. Two crops on this list, Hindiba and Sericea lespedeza, contain concentrated biological compounds called condensed tannins. Condensed tannins are not fertilizer. They are not protein. They do not show up in a dry matter yield report or a protein percentage analysis. They are invisible to every metric the wartime Anatolian agronomists were measuring. But here is what they do. When a grazing animal, specifically sheep and goats, the backbone of Anatolian pastoral farming across the highland provinces, consumes plant material high in condensed tannins, those compounds bind to the larvae of internal parasites in the gut. They disrupt the larvae's ability to develop. They reduce worm burdens. Measurably, consistently, in controlled trials replicated at the Faculty of Veterinary Medicine at Ankara University and the Aegean Agricultural Research Institute in Izmir. Barber pole worm, Haemonchus contortus, is the most economically damaging internal parasite in small ruminant operations across Anatolia. It kills animals. It drives up veterinary costs. It forces producers into chemical deworming rotations that are becoming less effective every year as resistance builds across the Turkish livestock sector. The wartime Anatolian farmers who planted Hindiba and Sericea lespedeza on their sheep and goat pastures above Erzurum and across the Konya highland were not fighting barber pole worm with a chemical. They were fighting it with a plant.
They just did not know that is what they were doing. They thought they were feeding their animals. They were. But the plant was doing something else at the same time, something that would have been worth knowing about in 1944 and is worth considerably more now, when anthelmintic resistance is a documented, growing crisis across the Anatolian sheep and goat industry. Here is the technique nobody taught across Anatolian farms.
When you combine Hindiba and Sericea lespedeza in the same grazing rotation, not as a monoculture, but as a deliberately sequenced pairing across different paddocks in your system, you create what researchers at Ankara University and collaborative teams through the Aegean Agricultural Research Institute in Izmir have been studying under the framework of nutraceutical forage management. You are not just feeding animals, you are running a passive parasite management program through the forage itself. The protocol emerging from this research looks like this for Anatolian conditions. In early summer, May and June across the Anatolian interior, rotate animals through Hindiba paddocks when chicory is in its vegetative stage. Before flowering, when protein is highest and tannin concentration is most bioavailable. Graze it rotationally, not continuously. Give it recovery time. In late summer and early autumn, August and September across the plateau, move animals through Sericea lespedeza paddocks. Sericea handles the Anatolian heat that Hindiba does not love. Its tannin profile is different from Hindiba's. The two compounds work on different parasite life stages. Together, they cover more of the parasite development cycle than either one does alone. You are not replacing your deworming protocol. You are reducing the parasite pressure your animals carry into that protocol, which means fewer treatments, slower resistance development, lower veterinary costs, and healthier animals spending more of their energy on growth and production rather than fighting a worm burden. The wartime Anatolian farmers stumbled into half of this system by accident across the highland pastures above Erzurum and the degraded plateau fields of Yozgat and Çorum. You can walk into all of it deliberately. The nitrogen stack. The second hidden system is simpler, but just as powerful for Anatolian farming economics. 3 crops on this list, hairy vetch, crimson clover, and Austrian winter pea, are all nitrogen-fixing legumes. Most Anatolian farmers know that individually. What the wartime extension bulletins from Ankara described, but never fully framed as a system, was what happens when you sequence them across the Anatolian cropping calendar. Plant hairy vetch in October across the Anatolian plateau. It overwinters through the -15-degree nights above Erzurum, fixes nitrogen through the cold months, and breaks down in early spring, releasing that nitrogen directly into the root zone at exactly the moment your spring cash crop or summer forage needs it most. Follow it with crimson clover in the rotation. Crimson clover adds another nitrogen pulse, provides early season grazing for the sheep coming down from the highland yelas, and its residue breaks down faster than most legumes, feeding the soil biology of the Anatolian clay rather than just depositing a nutrient number. Bring Austrian winter pea back in the October of the following year. Cold tolerant to the depths of the Erzurum winter, deep rooting through the compacted Anatolian plateau subsoil, capable of a third distinct nitrogen contribution at a different soil depth than the previous 2. Run that 3-year sequence on your Anatolian land, and you have built a self-funded fertility program. No purchased nitrogen from the cooperative, no synthetic inputs, no fertilizer bill. The wartime Anatolian farmers ran pieces of this sequence because scarcity forced them to, across the highland provinces. They did not have a choice. What they left behind in those trial reports sitting in filing cabinets in Ankara? Season by season observations across hundreds of test plots from Konya to Kars is the closest thing to a field-validated blueprint for this system that exists anywhere in Turkish agricultural literature. It was sitting in the archives the whole time. The tannin system, the nitrogen stack, 2 biological programs running quietly inside the list of 10 crops we just walked through across the length and breadth of Anatolia. The agronomists measured the yields. They missed the architecture. You do not have to. You just watched a video that most people will never finish. You did.
That tells me something about you. You are not here for entertainment. You are here because something in your operation on Anatolian soil is not working the way it should, and you are willing to sit with uncomfortable information long enough to find something useful. Good, because this is where that pays off. Subscribe.
Right now. Not because every channel says that. Because what we did in this video, pulling original trial reports from the Ankara archives, cross-referencing experiment station bulletins from Konya, Eskişehir, Erzurum, and Adana, tracing research from 1941 through to current university findings on condensed tannins at Ankara University and the Aegean Agricultural Research Institute, took months. There is more. These 10 crops are not the end of what the Anatolian wartime archive contains. There are forage species, rotational grazing protocols, and soil rehabilitation sequences from that era that have the same relationship to your feed bill across the Anatolian plateau that this video does. Documented, field-proven, largely forgotten in filing cabinets in Ankara. We are going to find them. Subscribe and you will be there when we do. Do not, and the algorithm decides. And algorithms are not good at knowing what your land in Anatolia actually needs. Leave one comment. This specific question, and I genuinely want the answer. Which of these 10 crops did you already know about, and where did you learn it? Because the institutional knowledge faded out of the Ankara Extension Service. But the human knowledge, the kind that lived in Anatolian farming families across the Konya Plain, in the highland villages above Erzurum, in the memory of a Büyük Baba who still planted hairy vetch every autumn without quite explaining why, some of that is still here. I think it is in this comment section. Tell me what you knew. Tell me what surprised you. Tell me what you are planting first and what your land looks like, whether you are on the Konya Plateau or the Black Sea coast or the Aegean Hills. Your comment shapes the next video. That is not a figure of speech. Share this with one person, not a mass share, one person. The farmer in your community running the highest feed bill right now. The one dealing with a parasite problem in his sheep that is not responding the way it used to. The one who bought a piece of Anatolian highland that looks like it cannot grow anything and has not figured out yet that the land is not the problem. The knowledge is. Send them this video. The wartime extension agents of the Turkish Ministry of Agriculture did not just mail bulletins from Ankara. They walked farm to farm across the Anatolian plateau because they knew a farmer who learned something from a neighbor was 10 times more likely to act on it than one who read it in a pamphlet. You are the extension agent now. Last spring, I planted hairy vetch on the back 40 deckers. Ground I had written off, acid clay, nothing had produced a stand in 6 years. By April, the sheep were grazing it. By June, the soil tests from the Konya Agricultural Research Station showed nitrogen levels I had not seen on any part of this Anatolian farm in 11 years of testing. One crop, one season. One bulletin from a filing cabinet in Ankara. The knowledge was always there. We just had to go looking.